The Art of Being Right, Arthur Schopenhauer. Preliminary, Logic and Dialectics. With the ancients, logic and dialectics were used as synonymous terms, though logistai, to think, consider, calculate, and dialegistai, to converse, are two very different things. The name dialectics was, as Diogenes Laertius informs us, first used by Plato, and in the Phaedrus, Sophist, Republic, Book 7, and elsewhere, we find that by dialectics he means the regular employment of reason and skill in the practice of it. Aristotle also uses the word in this sense, but according to Laurentius Valla, he was the first to use logic also in a similar sense. Dialectics, therefore, seems to be an older word than logic. Cicero and Quintilian use the words with the same general meaning. This use of the words as synonymous terms continued through the Middle Ages to modern times, indeed to the present day. But of late, and particularly by Kant, dialectic has often been used in a bad sense as meaning the art of sophistical controversy, and hence logic has been preferred as being the more innocent designation of the two. Yet both originally meant the same thing, and of late years they have been again recognized as synonyms. It is a pity that the words have been used in this way from time immemorial, and that I am not at full liberty to distinguish their meanings. Otherwise, I should have preferred to define logic from logos, word, and reason, which are inseparable, as the science of the laws of thought, that is, of the method of reason, and dialectic from dialogistai, to converse, and all conversation communicates facts or opinions, that is historical or deliberative, as the art of disputation in the modern sense of the word. It is clear, then, that logic deals with a subject of a purely a priori character, separable in definition from experience, namely the laws of thought, the process of reason, or the logos. The laws, that is, which reason follows when left to itself and unobstructed, as in the case of solitary thought on the part of a rational being who is in no way led into error. Dialectic, on the other hand, would deal with the relation between two rational beings who, because they are rational, ought to think in common, but who, as soon as they cease to agree like two clocks showing exactly the same time, enter into a dispute or intellectual competition. Considered as purely rational beings, the individuals would, I maintain, necessarily be in agreement, and their variation arises from the difference essential to individuality. In other words, it is derived from experience. Logic, therefore, as the science of thought or the science of the process of pure reason, must be capable of being constructed a priori. Dialectic, for the most part, can only be constructed a posteriori, that is, we can learn its rules by an experiential knowledge of the disturbance which pure thought undergoes through the difference of individuality manifested in the relation between two rational beings, and also by a knowledge of the means which the disputants adopt to justify to each other their own individual thought, and to show that it is pure and objective. For human nature is such that if A and B are engaged in common thought, and are communicating their opinions to each other on any subject, provided it is not a mere historical fact, and A perceives that B's thoughts on the same subject are not the same as his own, he does not begin by reviewing his own process of thought, in order to discover any error which he may have committed, but assumes that the error has occurred in B's. In other words, man is naturally obstinate, and this quality in him is accompanied by certain results, which are treated of in the branch of knowledge which I should like to call dialectics, but which, to avoid misunderstanding, I shall call controversial dialectics, or eristics. Consequently, it is the branch of knowledge which deals with the obstinacy natural to man. Eristics is only a harsher name for the same thing. Controversial dialectics. Controversial dialectics is the art of disputing, and of disputing in such a way as to remain firm whether one is right or wrong, per fas et nefas. A man may be objectively right, and yet in the eyes of the spectators, and sometimes in his own eyes, he may come off worse. For instance, I may give a proof of some assertion, and my adversary may refute the proof, and thus appear to have refuted the assertion, for which there may, however, be other proofs. In this case, of course, my adversary and I exchange places. He comes off better, though in fact he is wrong. If the reader asks how this is so, I answer that it is simply the natural baseness of human nature. If human nature were not base but entirely honorable, in every debate we should have no other object than the discovery of truth. We should not care a whit whether the truth should prove favorable to the opinion we had begun to express or to the opinion of our adversary. This we should regard as a matter of no importance, or at least of very secondary consequence. But as things stand, it is our chief concern. Our innate vanity, which is particularly sensitive to our intellectual faculties, will not permit us to admit that our first position was wrong, and that of our adversary right. The way out of this difficulty would be simply to take the trouble always to form a correct judgment. To do this, a man would have to think before he spoke. But in the majority of men, innate vanity is accompanied by innate loquacity and dishonesty. They speak before they think, and even if they afterwards perceive that they are wrong and that what they assert is false, they wish to make it appear otherwise. The interest in truth, which may be presumed to have been their sole motive when they declared the proposition supposedly true, now gives way to the interests of vanity. And thus, for the sake of vanity, what is true must appear false, and what is false must appear true. Yet this very dishonesty, this persistence in a proposition which seems false even to ourselves, has something to say in its favor. It often happens that we begin with a firm conviction of the truth of our assertion, but our opponent's argument seems to refute it. If we abandon our position at once, we may afterwards discover that we were right after all. The proof we offered was false, and yet there was a proof for our assertion which was true. The argument which would have been our salvation did not occur to us at the time. We therefore make it a rule to attack a counter-argument, even if, to all appearances, it is true and convincing, in the belief that its truth is only superficial, and that in the course of the dispute, another argument will occur to us by which we can either disprove it or succeed in confirming the truth of our assertion. In this way, we are almost compelled to become dishonest, or at least the temptation to do so is very great. Thus, the weakness of our intellect and the perversity of our will mutually support each other, and that, generally, a disputant fights, not for the truth but for his proposition, as if it were a battle pro aris et focus. He sets to work per facit nefas. Nay, as we have seen, he cannot easily do otherwise. As a rule, then, every man will insist on maintaining whatever he has said, even though he may for a moment consider it false or doubtful. To some extent, every man is armed against such a proceeding by his own cunning and villainy. He learns by daily experience and so comes to have his own natural dialectic, just as he has his own natural logic. But his dialectic is by no means so sure a guide as his logic. It is not so easy for anyone to think or draw an inference contrary to the laws of logic. False judgments are frequent, false conclusions very rare. A man cannot easily be deficient in natural logic, but he may very easily be deficient in natural dialectic, which is a gift distributed in unequal measure. In this respect, natural dialectic resembles the faculty of judgment, which differs in degree with every man, while reason, strictly speaking, is the same. For it frequently happens that, in a matter in which a man is really right, he is confounded, or refuted by merely superficial arguments, and if he emerges victorious in a dispute, he often owes it not so much to the correctness of his judgment in stating his proposition, as to the cunning and skill with which he has defended it. Here, as in all other cases, the best gifts are born with a man, yet much may be done to make him a master of this art by practice and also by consideration of the tactics which may be used to defeat an opponent, or which he himself employs for a similar purpose. Therefore, even if logic is of no real and practical use, dialectic certainly may be, and Aristotle also seems to me to have designed his logic proper, or analytics, as a foundation and preparation for his dialectic, and to have made it his chief task. Logic concerns itself with the mere form of propositions, dialectic with their content or matter, in a word, with their substance. It was proper, therefore, to consider the general form of all propositions before proceeding to the particulars. Aristotle does not define the subject matter of dialectic so exactly as I have done here, for though he admits that its chief subject matter is disputation, He at the same time declares that it is also the discovery of truth. Again, he says, later on, that if, from a philosophical point of view, propositions are treated according to their truth, dialectic considers them according to their plausibility, or the extent to which they will gain the approbation and assent of others. He is aware that the objective truth of a proposition must be distinguished and separated from the manner in which it is emphasized, and the approbation won for it, but he fails to draw a sufficiently sharp distinction between these two aspects of the question so as to reserve dialectic for the latter alone. The rules which he frequently gives for dialectic contain some of those which properly belong to logic, and therefore it seems to me that he has not furnished a clear solution of the problem. We must always keep the subject matter of one branch of knowledge quite distinct from that of any other. In order to form a clear idea of the province of dialectic, we must not pay attention to objective truth, which is a matter of logic. We must regard it simply as the art of getting the better of a dispute, which, as we have seen, is all the easier if we are really right. In itself, dialectic has nothing to do with anything but showing how a man can defend himself against attacks of every kind, and especially against dishonest attacks, and, likewise, how he can attack another man's assertion without contradicting himself or generally without being defeated. The discovery of objective truth must be separated from the art of obtaining acceptance for propositions, for objective truth is an entirely different matter. It is the task of common sense, reflection, and experience, for which there is no special art. Such, then, is the aim of dialectic. It has been defined as the logic of appearance, but the definition is wrong, for in that case it could only be used to repel false propositions. But even when a man has reason on his side, he needs dialectics to defend and maintain it. He must know what the underhanded tricks are in order to meet them. Nay, he must often make use of them himself, so as to defeat the enemy with his own weapons. Thus, in a dialectical dispute, we must leave objective truth aside, or rather, we must regard it as an accidental circumstance and seek only the defense of our own position and the refutation of that of our opponent. In following the rules for this purpose, one must not respect objective truth, for we generally do not know where it lies. As I have said, a man often does not know whether he is right or not. He often believes it and is mistaken. Both sides often believe it. Truth lies in the depths. At the beginning of a dispute, each man believes, as a rule, that the right is on his side. In the course of it, both become doubtful, and the truth is only determined or confirmed at the end. Dialectics, therefore, need have nothing to do with truth, any more than the fencing master considers who is right when a dispute leads to a duel. The parry and the thrust are the heart of the matter. Dialectics is the art of intellectual fencing, and it is only when we consider it in this way that we can erect it as a branch of knowledge. For if we take purely objective truth as our aim, we are reduced to mere logic. If we take the maintenance of false propositions, it is mere sophistry. And in both cases it would be necessary to presume that we were aware of what was true and what was false, and we seldom have any clear idea of truth beforehand. The true conception of dialectic, then, is that which we have formed. It is the art of intellectual fencing used for the purpose of getting the better of a contest. And though the name eristics would be more suitable, it is more correct to call a controversial dialectic, dialectica eristica. Dialectic, in this sense of the word, has no other object than to reduce to a regular system and to collect together and exhibit the arts which most men employ when they observe, in a contest, that truth is not on their side, and yet attempt to gain the battle. It would therefore be very inexpedient to pay any attention to objective truth, or to its advancement in a science of dialectic, since this is not done in that original and natural dialectic, innate to men, where they strive only for victory. The science of dialectics, in one sense of the word, is chiefly concerned with tabulating and analyzing dishonest stratagems, in order that in a real debate they may be at once recognized and defeated. It is for this very reason that dialectics must admittedly take victory, and not objective truth as its aim and purpose. I am not aware of anything having been done in this direction, though I have made many investigations. It is therefore uncultivated ground. To attain our purpose, we must fall back upon our experience. We must observe how, in the debates which frequently arise in our relations with our fellow men, this or that stratagem is employed by one side or the other. By discovering the common elements and tricks repeated in different forms, we shall be able to exhibit certain general stratagems which may be advantageous, both for our own use and for the thwarting of others if they use them. What follows must be considered a first attempt. According to Diogenes Laertius, Volume 28, Aristotle united rhetoric and dialectic with a view to persuasion, pythanon, and analytics and philosophy with a view to truth. Aristotle, in fact, distinguishes between logic or analytics as the theory or method for arriving at true or apodictic conclusions, and dialectic as the method for arriving at conclusions that are accepted or passed off as true. Eudoxa, probabilia, conclusions concerning which it is not taken for granted that they are false, and also not taken for granted that they are true in themselves, since that is not the point. What is this but the art of being right, whether one has any reason to be right or not, in other words, the art of attaining the appearance of truth, independently of its substance. This, then, is as I put it above. Aristotle divides all conclusions into logical and dialectical, in the manner described, and then into eristic. Eristic is the method by which the form of the conclusion is correct, but the premises, the materials from which it is drawn, are not true, but only appear to be true. Finally, sophistry is the method by which the form of the conclusion is false, although it appears to be correct. These last three belong properly to the art of controversial dialectic, for they have no objective truth in view, but only the appearance of it, and do not take into account the truth itself. That is, they aim at victory. Aristotle's book on sophistical conclusions was published separately from the others and at a later date. It was the last book of his dialectic. Machiavelli recommends his prince to take advantage of every moment of his neighbor's weakness to attack him. Otherwise, his neighbor may do the same. If honor and fidelity prevailed in the world, it would be a different matter. But as these are unexpected qualities, a man ought not to practice them because he will meet with a bad response. It is just the same in a dispute. If I admit my opponent to be right as soon as he appears to be, he is not likely to do the same when the position is reversed, and as he acts wrongly, I am compelled to act wrongly too. It is easy to say that we ought to yield to the truth without any prejudice in favor of our own statements, but we cannot assume that our opponent will do so, and therefore we cannot do so either. Nay, if I were to abandon the position which I had long before thought of, as soon as it appeared that he was right, it might easily happen that I should be deceived by a momentary impression and give up the truth for an error. On the other hand, in his book, De Sophisticis Elenchis, he takes great pains to separate dialectic from sophistics and eristics, where the distinction consists in that dialectical conclusions are true in their form and in their content, while sophistic and eristic conclusions are false. Eristics differ so much from sophistics that, while the master of eristics aims at mere victory, the sophist seeks reputation, and with it the monetary rewards which he will obtain. But whether a proposition is true in respect of its content is too uncertain a question to ground the distinction in question, and it is a question on which the disputant can least arrive at certainty, nor is it very certainly revealed even by the result of the disputation. When Aristotle therefore speaks of dialectic, we must include in it sophistry, eristics, and pirastics, and define it as the art of getting the better of a dispute, in which unquestionably the safest plan is to be right from the beginning. But this alone does not suffice in the present disposition of mankind, and on the other hand, with the weakness of the human intellect, it is not altogether necessary. Other expedients are necessary, which, precisely because they are unnecessary for the attainment of objective truth, may also be resorted to when a man is objectively wrong. And whether this is or is not the case is hardly a question of absolute certainty. I am of opinion, therefore, that a sharper distinction ought to be drawn between dialectic and logic than that which Aristotle has given us, that to logic we must attribute objective truth insofar as it is merely formal, and that dialectic must be confined to the art of arriving at a point. and conversely that sophistry and euristics must not be distinguished from dialectic after the manner of Aristotle, since the difference which he draws lies in objective and material truth. And as to what this is, we can obtain no clear certainty before the discussion, but we are compelled with Pilate to ask, what is truth? For truth lies in the depths, in Buto and Aletheia, a saying of Democritus, Diog. Laerter 9. Two men often engage in a heated argument and then return to their homes, each with the other's opinion, which he has exchanged for his own. It is easy to say that in every dispute we must have no other aim than the advancement of truth. But before the dispute, no one knows where it is, and through the arguments of the opponent and of his own, the man is deceived. Diogenes Laertes tells us that among the numerous writings on rhetoric by Theophrastus, all of which have been lost, there was one entitled The Theory of the Fighters About the Quarrelers. This would be exactly what we wanted, the basis of all. Dialectic. First of all, we must consider the essential nature of every dispute, what actually happens in it. Our opponent has advanced a thesis, or we ourselves. It is all the same thing. There are two ways of refuting it and two courses which we may follow. The modes are relative to the thing, relative to the person, or from concessions. In other words, we can show that the proposition is not in accordance with the nature of things, that is, with absolute and objective truth, or which is inconsistent with other assertions or admissions of our opponent, that is, with the truth as it appears to him. This latter way of arguing a point produces only a relative conviction, and makes no difference to the objective truth of the matter. The two paths we can follow are direct refutation and indirect refutation. Direct refutation attacks the reason for the thesis, the indirect its results. Direct refutation demonstrates that the thesis is not true, the indirect, that it cannot be true. The direct course admits a double procedure. Either we can show that the reasons for the statement are false, nego majorum, minorum, or we can admit the reasons or premises but show that the statement does not follow from them, nego the consequence. That is, we attack the conclusion or form of the syllogism. Direct refutation makes use of either the detour or the instance. A. The deviation. We accept our opponent's proposition as true, and then show what follows from it when we place it in connection with some other proposition known to be true. We use the two propositions as premises of a syllogism, which gives a conclusion which is manifestly false, as contradicting the nature of things or other statements of our opponent himself. That is, the conclusion is false ad rem or ad hominem. Consequently, our opponent's proposition must have been false, for while true premises can only give a true conclusion, false premises need not always give a false one. B. The instance, or the contrary example. It consists in refuting the general proposition by direct reference to particular cases which are included in it in the manner in which it is stated, but to which it does not apply, and by which therefore it is shown to be necessarily false. Such is the structure or skeleton of all forms of dispute, for to it every kind of controversy can ultimately be reduced. A whole controversy may, however, proceed in the manner described, or only appear to do so, and can be supported by genuine or spurious arguments. It is precisely because it is not easy to discover the truth about this subject that the debates are so long and so obstinate. Nor can we, in ordering the argument, separate the real from the apparent truth, since even the disputants are not certain of it beforehand. I shall therefore describe the various tricks or stratagems without taking into account questions of objective truth or falsehood, for this is a question about which we are not certain and which cannot be determined beforehand. Besides, in every dispute or argument on any subject, we must agree about something, and therefore, as a principle, we must be willing to judge of the matter in question. We cannot argue with those who deny principles. Against him who denies principles he must not be disputed. Extension. It consists in carrying your opponent's proposition beyond its natural limits, in giving it as general a meaning and as wide a sense as possible, so as to exaggerate it, and on the other hand, in giving your own proposition as restricted a meaning and as narrow a bound as possible, because the more general a statement becomes, the more numerous are the objections to which it is open. The defense consists in a precise statement of the essential point or question in question. Example 1. I have asserted that the English were supreme in the drama. My opponent attempted to give a contrary example and replied that it was a well-known fact that in music and consequently in opera, they could do absolutely nothing. I countered his attack by reminding him that music was not included in the dramatic art, which included only tragedy and comedy. He knew this very well. What he had done was to attempt to generalize my proposition so that it applied to all theatrical performances and consequently to opera and then to music, in order to ensure his defeat. On the contrary, we may save our proposition by reducing it to narrower limits than we intended at first, if our manner of expressing it favors this expedient. Example 2. A declares that the peace of 1814 restored independence to all the German cities of the Hanseatic League. B gives a contrary example, citing the fact that Danzig, which had received its independence from Bonaparte, lost it with that peace. A defends himself thus: I said all the German cities, and Danzig was in Poland. This trick was mentioned by Aristotle in the Topica, Book 8. Example 3. Lamarck in his Zoological Philosophy, Volume 1, asserts that the polyp has no sensibility because it has no nerves. It is certain, however, that it possesses some kind of perception, for it advances towards the light by moving ingeniously from branch to branch and captures its prey. It is therefore supposed that its nervous system is spread over its whole body in equal measure, as if it were mixed with it. For it is obvious that the polyp possesses some faculty of perception without possessing separate sense organs. Since this assumption refutes Lamarck's position, he argues thus: in that case, every part of its body must be capable of every kind of feeling, and also of movement, of will, of thought. The polyp would have all the organs of the most perfect animal in every point of its body. Each point could see, smell, taste, hear, and so on. What is more, it could think, judge, and draw conclusions. Every particle of its body would be a perfect animal, and would be superior to man, for every part of it would possess all the faculties which man possesses only in his totality. Moreover, there would be no reason not to extend what is true of the polyp to all monads, to the most imperfect of all creatures, and ultimately to plants which are also living, etc., etc. By using dialectical tricks of this kind, a writer reveals that he is secretly aware of being wrong. Since it has been said that the creature's entire body is sensitive to light and therefore possesses nerves, he concludes that its entire body is capable of thinking homonymy. This trick is to extend a proposition to something which has little or nothing in common with the subject in question, except the similarity of the word, then to refute it triumphantly, and thus claim credit for having refuted the original statement. It may be noted here that synonyms are two words for the same conception. Homonyms, two conceptions which are covered by the same word. See Aristotle, Topica, Book. Deep, sharp, high, used now of bodies, now of tones, are homonyms. Honorable and honest are synonyms. This is a trick which may be considered identical with sophistry ex homonymia, though if the sophistry be obvious, it will deceive no one. Every light can be put out. The intellect is a light, therefore it can be put out. Here it is at once clear that there are four terms in the syllogism, light being used both in the real and in the metaphorical sense. But if the sophistry assumes a subtle form, it is naturally apt to mislead, especially when the conceptions covered by the same word are related and apt to be interchangeable. It is never subtle enough to deceive if used intentionally, and therefore instances of it must be collected from actual and individual experience. It would be very nice if every trick could be given a short and obviously appropriate name, so that when a man used this or that particular trick, he could be immediately reprimanded for it. I will give two examples of homonymy. Example 1a. You are not yet initiated into the mysteries of Kantian philosophy. B. If it is mysteries you are talking about, I want nothing to do with them. Example 2. I have condemned the principle involved in the word honor as foolish, for according to it, a man loses his honor by receiving every insult, which he cannot erase unless he answers with a still greater insult, either by shedding his adversary's blood or his own. I have argued that a man's true honor cannot be outraged by what he suffers, but solely and exclusively by what he does, for there is no telling what may happen to any of us. My opponent immediately attacked the reason I had given and triumphantly proved to me that when a merchant was falsely accused of misrepresentation, dishonesty, or negligence in his business, it was an attack on his honor, which in this case was outraged solely by what he had suffered, and which he could only recover by punishing his aggressor and making him recant. Here, by a homonymy, he was imposing civic honor, which is also called good name, and which can be outraged by libel and slander on the conception of chivalric honor, also called point of honor, which can be outraged by insult, and as an attack on the first cannot be disregarded, but must be repelled by public refutation. So, on the same grounds, an attack on the second must not be disregarded, but must be defeated by a still greater insult and a duel. Here we have a confusion of two essentially different things, owing to the homonymy in the word honor, and a consequent alteration of the point in dispute. Generalize the specific statements of your opponent. Another trick is to take a proposition formulated, relatively and in reference to some specific subject, as if it were uttered with a general or absolute application, or at least to take it in a quite different sense and then refute it. Aristotle's example is this: a Moor is black, but as to his teeth, he is white. Therefore he is both black and not black. This is an obvious sophism, which will deceive no one. Let us compare it with one drawn from actual experience. In speaking of philosophy, I admitted that my system supported the quietists and praised them. Presently the conversation turned to Hegel, and I maintained that his writings were mostly nonsense, or at least that there were many passages in them where the author wrote the words, and it was for the reader to find a meaning for them. My opponent did not attempt to refute this assertion ad rem, but contented himself with putting the argument to the man, and telling me that I had just praised the quietists, and that they had also written a good deal of nonsense. I admitted this, but to correct him I said that I had praised the quietists, not as philosophers and writers, that is, for their achievements in the sphere of theory, but only as men, and for their conduct in mere practical matters, and that in the case of Hegel we were speaking of theories. In this way I parried the attack. The first three tricks are of a similar nature. They have in common this, that something other than what is asserted is attacked. It would therefore be an irrelevant conclusion to let oneself be undone in this way, for in all the examples I have given, what the opponent says is true, but it is an apparent, not real, contradiction to the thesis. All that the man whom he is attacking needs to do is to deny the validity of his syllogism, to deny, namely, the conclusion which he draws, that because his proposition is true, ours is false. In this way his refutation is itself directly refuted, by a denial of his conclusion, by the denial of the consequence. Another trick is to refuse to admit true premises on account of a foreseen conclusion. There are two ways of defeating him, embodied in the next two sections. Hide your game. If you want to draw a conclusion, you must not let it be foreseen, but must make the premises be admitted one by one, unobserved, by mixing them here and there, in your speech. Otherwise your opponent will try all sorts of tricks. Or, if it is doubtful whether your opponent will admit them, you must present the premises of these premises. That is, you must draw up prosyllogisms, and make the premises of several of them be admitted in no definite order. In this way you conceal your game until you have obtained all the necessary admissions and thus attained your object in drawing a circuit. These rules are given by Aristotle in his Topica, Book 8. It is a trick which needs no illustration. False propositions. 2. Prove the truth of a proposition. You may also employ previous propositions which are not true, if your opponent refuses to admit the true ones, either because he cannot perceive their truth, or because he sees that the thesis immediately follows from them. In this case, the plan is to take propositions which are false in themselves, but true for your opponent, and argue from his way of thinking, that is, from his concessions. For a true conclusion may follow from false premises, but not vice versa. In the same way, your opponent's false propositions may be refuted by other false propositions, which he nevertheless considers true. For it is with him that you have to deal, and you must use the thoughts which he uses. For example, if he is a member of some sect to which you do not belong, you may employ the declared opinions of that sect against him as principles. Postulate what needs to be proved. Another plan is to beg the question in disguise by postulating what needs to be proved either under another name. For example, good reputation instead of honor, virtue instead of virginity, etc., or by using convertible terms such as red-blooded animals and vertebrates, or by making a general assumption covering the particular point in dispute. For example, by maintaining the uncertainty of medicine, by postulating the uncertainty of all human knowledge. If, conversely, two things follow from each other, and one is to be proved, you may postulate the other. If a general proposition is to be proved, you may make your opponent admit every detail. This is the reverse of the second. Allow admissions by questions. If the disputation is conducted in a somewhat strict and formal manner, and there is a desire to arrive at a very clear understanding, he who states the proposition and wishes to prove it may proceed against his opponent by means of questions in order to demonstrate the truth of the assertion from his admissions. This arothematic or Socratic method was especially in use among the ancients, and this and some of the tricks which have subsequently followed are similar to it. The plan is to ask many broad questions at once, in order to conceal what you wish, to have admitted and, on the other hand, to rapidly propound the argument resulting from the admissions, for those who are slow of understanding cannot follow accurately, and do not perceive any errors or gaps which may be in the demonstration. Make your opponent annoyed. This trick consists in making your opponent annoyed. For when he is annoyed, he is incapable of judging correctly, and of perceiving where his advantage lies. You may irritate him by doing him repeated injustices, or by practicing some kind of cheating, and by being generally insolent. Questions in order of deviation. Or you may put the questions in a different order from that which the conclusion to be drawn from them requires, and transpose them, so as not to let him know what your object is. He will then be unable to take precautions. You may also use his answers to draw different or even opposite conclusions, according to the nature of them. This is similar to the trick of masking your procedure. Take advantage of the pessimist. If you observe that your opponent intentionally returns a negative answer to questions which, for the sake of your proposition, you wish him to answer in the affirmative, you should ask the converse of the proposition, as if it were that which you were anxious to see affirmed, or, at any rate, you may give him the choice of both, so that he does not perceive which of them you are asking him to affirm. Generalize admissions of specific cases. If you make an induction, and your opponent grants you the particular cases by which it is to be supported, you must refrain from asking whether he also admits the general truth which results from the particulars, but introduce it afterwards as an established and admitted fact. For in the meantime, he himself will come to believe that he has admitted it, and the same impression will be received by the audience, because they will remember the many questions about the particulars and suppose that they must of course have attained their object. Choose metaphors favorable to your proposition. If the conversation turns upon some general conception which has no specific name, but which demands some figurative or metaphorical designation, you must begin by choosing a metaphor which will be favorable to your proposition. For instance, the names used to denote the two political parties in Spain, Serviles and Liberales, are obviously chosen by the latter. The name Protestants is chosen by them, as is the name Evangelicals. But the Catholics call them heretics. Similarly, with regard to the names of things which admit of a more exact and definite meaning, for instance, if your opponent proposes an alteration, you may call it an innovation, for that is an odious word. If you make the proposal yourself, it will be the reverse. In the first case, you may call the antagonistic principle the existing order, in the second, antiquated prejudice. What an impartial man with no other purpose to serve would call public worship or a system of religion is described by an adherent as piety, godliness, and by an opponent as intolerance, superstition. It is, at bottom, a subtle begging of the question. What is sought to be proved is first of all inserted into the definition, whence it is then extracted by mere analysis. What one man calls putting into safe custody, another calls casting into prison. A speaker often reveals his purpose beforehand by the names he gives to things. One may speak of the clergy, another of the priests. To make your opponent accept a proposition, you must present him with the counter-proposition also, and let him choose between the two. And you must make the contrast as evident as possible, so that, to avoid being paradoxical, he will accept the proposition, which thus seems quite probable. For example, if you want to make him admit that a boy ought to do everything his father tells him to do, ask him whether in all things we ought to obey or disobey our parents. Or, if a thing is said to occur often, ask him whether by often you are to understand few or many cases, and he will say, many. It is as if you put gray next to black and called it white, or next to white and called it black. Claim victory. Despite defeat. Of all the tricks of controversy, this is the most frequent and is instinctively used. We hear of religious zeal or fanaticism, gaffe, act of gallantry or adultery, an ambiguous or obscene story, embarrassment or bankruptcy, by influence and connections, or by bribery and nepotism, sincere gratitude, or good remuneration. Agree to reject the counter-proposal. This, which is a shameless trick, is performed as follows. When your opponent has answered several of your questions without the answers being favorable to the conclusion you aim at, present the desired conclusion, though it does not fit in at all, as if it had been proved, and proclaim it in a tone of triumph. If your opponent is timid or stupid, and you yourself possess a good deal of impudence and a good voice, the trick may easily succeed. It is similar to the fallacy non causae ut causae. You see apparently absurd propositions. If you have advanced a paradoxical proposition and find it difficult to prove it, you may submit to your opponent for acceptance or rejection some true proposition, the truth of which, however, is not entirely palpable, as if you wish to extract its proof from it. If he rejects it as a trick, you may gain your triumph by showing how absurd it is. If he accepts it, you have reason on your side for the time being, and must now look about you, or else you may employ the former trick also and maintain that your paradox is proved by the proposition which he has accepted. For this, an extreme degree of impudence is necessary, but experience shows instances of it, and there are people who practice it instinctively. Arguments ad hominem. Another trick is to use arguments relative to person or from concessions. When your opponent makes a proposition, you should try to see whether it is not in some way, if necessary only apparently, inconsistent with some other proposition he has made or admitted, or with the tenets of a school or sect which he has praised and approved, or with the actions of those who support the sect, or else of those who give it only apparent and spurious support, or with your own actions or lack of action. For example, if he advocates suicide, you may immediately exclaim, "Why don't you hang yourself?" If he maintains that Berlin is an unpleasant place to live, you may say, "Why don't you leave by the first train?" Some such nonsense is always possible. Defense by subtle distinction. If your opponent presses you with a counterproof, you can often save yourself by bringing forward some subtle distinction which, it is true, did not occur to you before. That is, if the subject admits of a double application or is taken in any ambiguous sense. Interrupt, break, deviate the dispute. If you observe that your opponent has adopted a line of argument which will result in his defeat, you must not allow him to carry it through to the end, but either stop the course of the discussion in time or stop it altogether, or divert him from the subject and lead him to another. In short, you must perform the trick which will be noticed later, the change of controversy. Generalize the subject, and then argue against it. Should your opponent expressly challenge you to present any objection to some particular point in his argument and you have not much to say, try to give a general treatment of the subject and then reply. If you are asked to explain why a particular physical hypothesis cannot be accepted, you may speak of the fallibility of human knowledge and give several examples of it. Draw your own conclusions. After you have evoked all your premises and your opponent has admitted them, you must refrain from asking him for the conclusion but draw it at once for yourself. Or rather, even if one or other of the premises is wanting, you may consider it as if it had been admitted also and draw the conclusion. This trick is an application of the fallacy non causa ut causa. Meet him with a counter-argument as bad as his. When your opponent uses a merely superficial or sophistical argument and you perceive it, you may, it is true, refute it by exposing its specious and superficial character. But it is better to meet him with a counter-argument equally superficial and sophistical, and thus dispose of him, for it is with victory that you are concerned, and not with truth. If, for instance, he adopts an argument against the person, it is enough to take away its force by a counter-argument ad hominem, or argument from concession, and in general, instead of stating the true state of the case at the same length, it is shorter to take this course if it be available. Begging the principle. If your opponent demands that you admit something from which the point in dispute will immediately follow, you should refuse to do so, declaring that it is a petitio principii, for he and the public will regard a proposition which is close to the point in dispute as identical with it, and thus you deprive him of his best argument. Make him exaggerate his statement. Contradiction and contention irritate a man and lead him to exaggerate his statement. By contradicting your opponent, you may lead him to extend beyond its proper limits a statement which, within those limits and in itself, is in any case true. And when you refute this exaggerated form, it seems as if you have also refuted his original statement. On the contrary, you must be careful not to allow yourself to be led by contradiction and lead him to exaggerate or extend a statement of your own. It will often happen that your opponent himself will directly attempt to extend your statement beyond what you intended, in which case you must immediately stop him and bring him back to the limits which you have set. That is what I said, and nothing more. Turn the table state a false syllogism. This trick consists in stating a false syllogism. Your opponent makes a proposition, and by false inference and distortion of his ideas, you force from it other propositions which it does not contain and which he does not mean at all, or rather which are absurd or dangerous. It then appears as if his proposition has given rise to others which are inconsistent with itself, or with some acknowledged truth, and thus it appears to be indirectly refuted. This is the diversion, and is another application of the fallacy non causa ut causa. Find an instance of the contrary. This is a case of diversion by means of an instance of the contrary. With an induction, epagogue, a great number of particular instances are necessary to establish it as a universal proposition. But with the diversion, apagogue, a single instance, to which the proposition does not apply, is all that is necessary to overthrow it. This is a controversial method known as instance, instantia, eustasis. For instance, all ruminants have horns, is a proposition which may be frustrated by the single instance of the camel. The instance is a case in which a universal truth is sought to be applied, and something is inserted into the fundamental definition of it which is not universally true, and by which it is frustrated. But there is room for error, and when this trick is employed by your opponent, you must observe whether the example he gives is really true. For there are problems of which the only true solution is that the case in question is not true, e.g. many miracles, ghost stories, and so on, and whether it really fits the conception of truth thus stated, for it may only seem so, and the matter must be settled by sharp distinctions, and whether it is really inconsistent with that conception, for this again may be only an apparent inconsistency. A brilliant move is the turn of argument or reversal of roles by which your opponent's argument is turned against itself. He says, for example, "So-and-so is a child, you must take him into account." You retort, Just because he is a child, I must correct him, otherwise he will persist in his bad habits. Anger indicates a weak point. Should your opponent catch you becoming particularly angry about an argument, you should press it with even greater zeal, not only because it is good to anger him, but because it may be assumed that you have put your finger on the weak point of his case, and that just here he is more open to attack than you at the moment realize. Persuade the audience, not the opponent, is especially practicable in a dispute between scholars in the presence of uneducated people. If you have no argument to the point and none concerning the person, you can make an ad auditories. That is, you can initiate some invalid objection, which, however, only an expert would see as invalid. Now, your opponent is an expert, but those who form his audience are not, and therefore in their eyes he is defeated, particularly if the objection you make places him in some ridiculous light. People are ready to laugh, and you have the laughers on your side. To show that your objection is futile would require a long explanation on the part of your opponent, and a reference to the principles of the branch of knowledge in question, or to the elements of the subject you are discussing, and people are not disposed to listen to it. For example, your opponent asserts that in the original formation of a mountain range, the granite and other elements in its composition were, by reason of their high temperature, in a fluid or molten state, that the temperature must have reached about 480 degrees Fahrenheit, and that when the mass took shape it was covered by the sea. You reply by an argument at auditories that at that temperature, or rather long before it was reached, that is, at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the sea would have evaporated and spread itself through the air in the form of vapor. At this the audience laughs. To refute the objection, your opponent would have to show that the boiling point depends not only on the degree of heat, but also on the atmospheric pressure, and that as soon as about half the water in the sea had evaporated in the form of vapor, this pressure would have increased so much that the remainder would not boil even at a temperature of 480 degrees. He is prevented from giving this explanation because it would require a treatise to demonstrate the subject to those who are not acquainted with physics. Deviation. If you find that you are being wronged, you may make a diversion. That is, you may suddenly begin to speak of something else, as if it had some bearing on the subject in dispute and constituted an argument against your opponent. This may be done without presumption, if the diversion has in fact some general bearing on the subject, but it is an act of impudence if it has nothing to do with the case and is only put forward as a way of attacking your opponent. This is the argument from authority. It consists in appealing to authority instead of reason, and in using an authority which is adequate to the degree of knowledge of your opponent. For instance, I praised the system in China, where there is no hereditary. Nobility and offices are given only to those who pass competitive examinations. My opponent maintained that knowledge, as well as the privilege of birth, of which he had a great regard, qualifies a man for office. We argued, and he got the worst of it. Then he digressed and declared that in China all ranks were punished by bastinado, which he associated with immoderate indulgence in tea, and proceeded to make both of these objects of reproach to the Chinese. To follow him in all this would be to give up the victory already won. Digression is mere impudence if it leaves the point in dispute altogether, and raises, for instance, some objection such as, "Yes, and you said so just now," and so on. For then the argument becomes, to a certain extent, personal, of the kind which will be dealt with in the last section. Strictly speaking, it is halfway between the argumentum ad personam, which will be discussed there, and the argumentum ad hominem. How innate this trick is may be seen in every quarrel between common people. If one party makes some personal reproach against the other, the latter, instead of replying by refuting it, allows it to stand, as it were, admits it, and replies by reproaching his antagonist on some other ground. This is a stratagem similar to that used by Scipio when he attacked the Carthaginians not in Italy but in Africa. In war, diversions of this kind may be profitable, but in a quarrel they are poor expedients because the reproaches remain, and those who watch hear the worst that can be said of both parties. It is a trick which should be used only for want of anything better, appeal to authority, instead of reason. Every man prefers belief to the exercise of judgment, says Seneca, and therefore it is an easy matter if you have an authority on your side, whom your opponent respects. The more limited his ability and knowledge, the greater the number of authorities who support him. But if his ability and knowledge are of a high order, there are very few, indeed almost none. He may perhaps admit the authority of professionals versed in a science, art, or craft of which he knows little or nothing. But even then he will regard them with suspicion. On the contrary, the common people have a deep respect for professionals of all kinds. They do not know that a man who makes a profession of anything loves it not for the object itself, but for the money he gets by it, or that it is rare for a man who teaches to know his subject thoroughly, for if he studies it as he ought, in most cases he has no time left to teach it. But there are many authorities which find respect among the multitude, and if you have none which is quite adequate, you can choose one which seems to be so. You can quote what someone has said in another sense or under other circumstances. Authorities which your opponent cannot understand are those which he usually thinks most of. The uneducated have a peculiar respect for a Greek or Latin flourish. You can also, if necessary, not only distort your authorities but even falsify them, or quote something which you have invented yourself. As a rule, your opponent has no books at hand and could not use them if he had. The best illustration of this is furnished by the French curate, who, in order to avoid being compelled, like other citizens, to pave the street in front of his house, quoted a saying which he described as biblical, "Let them be terrified, I will not be terrified." This was enough for the municipal officials. A universal prejudice may also be used as authority. For most people think, like Aristotle, that what many believe may be said to exist. There is no opinion, however absurd, which men will not readily adopt as soon as they are convinced that it is generally held. Example affects their thinking, just as it affects their action. They are like sheep following the bell, just as it leads them. They would rather die than think. It is very curious that the universality of an opinion should carry so much weight with people, since their own experience may tell them that its acceptance is an entirely unreflective and merely imitative process. But it tells them nothing of the sort because they have no self-knowledge at all. It is only the elect who say with Plato that many people have many feelings, which means that the public has many bees in its bonnet, and that it would be a long job to reach them. But, to speak seriously, the universality of an opinion is no proof nor even a probability that the opinion is correct. Those who maintain that this is so must assume that the extension of time deprives a universal opinion of its demonstrative force, for otherwise all the ancient errors which were once universally held to be true would have to be recalled. For instance, the Ptolemaic system would have to be restored, or Catholicism re-established in all Protestant countries. They must assume that spatial distance has the same effect. Otherwise, the respective universality of opinion among the adherents of Buddhism, Christianity, and Mohammedanism will get them into difficulty. When we come to analyze the matter, the so-called universal opinion is the opinion of 2 or 3 persons, and we should be persuaded of this if we could see how it really arises. We should find that it was 2 or 3 persons who, in the first instance, accepted it, or defended and maintained it, and of whom the people were so sensible as to believe that they had thoroughly tested it. Afterwards, some other persons, convinced beforehand that the former were men of the necessary ability, also accepted the opinion. These, in turn, were trusted by many others, whose laziness suggested to them that it was better to believe at once than to submit to the arduous task of testing the matter for themselves. Thus the number of these lazy and credulous adherents increased daily, for the opinion had scarcely obtained a reasonable measure of support when its subsequent advocates attributed it to the fact that the opinion could only have obtained it by the coherence of its arguments. The remainder were then compelled to concede what was universally conceded, lest they should be thought undisciplined persons who resisted opinions which were accepted by all, or impudent fellows who thought themselves cleverer than anyone else. When opinion has reached this stage, adherence becomes a duty, and henceforth the few who are capable of forming a judgment are silent. Those who venture to speak are those who are entirely incapable of forming any opinion or judgment of their own, being only the echo of the opinions of others, and yet they defend them with still greater zeal and intolerance. For what they hate in people who think differently is not so much the different opinions they profess, as the presumption of wanting to form their own judgment, a presumption of which they themselves are never guilty, as they well know. In short, there are very few who can think, but every man wants to have an opinion, and what remains but to take it ready-made from others instead of forming opinions for himself? Since this is what happens, where is the value of the opinion of 100 millions? It is no more established than a historical fact related by 100 chroniclers who can be proved to have plagiarized one from another. Opinion, in the end, can be traced back to a single individual. It is all what I say, what you say, and finally what he says. And all this is nothing but a series of assertions. I say, you say, but finally he also said, and after saying so many times you see nothing of what has been said. Yet in a dispute with ordinary people, we may employ universal opinion as authority. For it is generally found that when two of them are fighting, this is the weapon which both choose as a means of attack. If a man of better quality has to deal with them, it is more advisable that he should also condescend to use this weapon, and select authorities which impress the weak side of his opponent. For by hypothesis, he is as insensible to all rational argument as a calloused Siegfried, plunged in the torrent of incapacity and incapable of thought or judgment. Before a court, the dispute is only between authorities, I mean authoritative statements as established by legal experts, and here, the exercise of judgment consists in finding out what law or authority applies to the case in question. There is, however, plenty of room for dialectics, for if the case in question and the law do not fit together, they may, if necessary, be distorted until they appear to fit, or vice versa. That is beyond me. If you know that you have no answer to the arguments advanced by your opponent, you may, with a fine stroke of irony, declare yourself an incompetent judge. What you now say surpasses my scanty capacity of comprehension. It may all be true, but I cannot understand it, and I refrain from expressing any opinion on it. In this way you insinuate to the spectators, with whom you are in good standing, that what your opponent says is nonsense. Thus, when Kant's critique first appeared, or rather when it began to make a noise in the world, many teachers of the old eclectic school declared that they did not understand it, believing that its failure settled the question. But when the adherents of the new school proved to them that they were right, and that they had really not understood it, they became very ill-tempered. This is a trick that can only be used when you are sure that the public thinks much better of you than of your opponent. A teacher, for example, might try this on a student. Strictly speaking, it is the same trick as before. It is a particularly malicious assertion of one's own authority, instead of giving reasons. The counter trick is to say, "Excuse me, but with your penetrating intellect, it must be very easy for you to understand anything, and the only fault may be my bad statement of the subject," and then to continue to press it upon him until he understands whether he will or not, and sees for himself that it was really his fault. In this way, you defend yourself against his attack. With the greatest politeness, he meant to insinuate that you were talking nonsense, and you, with equal politeness, prove to him that he is a fool. Put your thesis in some odious category. If you come across a statement, there is a quick way of getting rid of it, or at least of throwing suspicion upon it by classifying it in some odious category, even if the connection is only apparent or of a vague character. You may say, for example, that is Manichaeism, or that is Arianism, or Pelagianism, or idealism, or Spinozism, or pantheism, or Brownianism, or naturalism, or atheism, or rationalism, spiritualism, mysticism, and so on. In making an objection of this kind, you take it for granted that the statement in question is identical with the category cited, or at least contained in it. That is, you exclaim, "Ah, I have heard that before," and that the system mentioned has been thoroughly refuted, and does not contain a word of truth. It applies in theory, but not in practice. That is all very well in theory, but it does not work in practice. In this sophism, you admit the premises, but deny the conclusion, in contradiction to a well-known rule of logic. The statement is based on an impossibility. What is right in theory must work in practice, and if it does not work, there is an error in the theory. Something has been overlooked and not taken into account, and consequently, what is wrong in practice is also wrong in theory. Don't let it escape. When you ask a question or argue, and your opponent does not give you a direct or indirect answer, but evades it by a counter-question or an indirect answer, or some statement unrelated to the subject, and generally tries to change the subject, it is a sure sign that you have touched a weak point, sometimes without knowing it. You have, as it were, reduced him to silence. You must therefore insist on the point still more, and not let your opponent evade it, even when you do not know where the weak point you have touched really lies. Will is more effective than intuition. There is another trick which, as soon as it becomes practicable, renders all others unnecessary. Instead of influencing your opponent's intellect by arguments, influence his will by motives. And he and the audience too, if they have similar interests, will be immediately won over to your opinion, even if you had taken them out of a madhouse. For as a general rule, half an ounce of will is more effective than 100 pounds of wit and intelligence. This, it is true, can only be done under peculiar circumstances, if you can make your opponent feel that his opinion, if it proves true, will be clearly prejudicial to his interests. He will drop it like a hot potato, and feel that it was very unwise to accept it. A clergyman, for instance, is advocating some philosophical dogma. You make him see that it is in immediate contradiction to one of the fundamental doctrines of his church, and he abandons it. A landowner asserts that the use of machinery in agricultural operations, as practiced in England, is an excellent institution, as one machine does the work of many men. You give him to understand that it will not be long before carriages will also be driven by steam, and that the value of his large stud farm will be greatly diminished, and you will see what he will say. In such cases, every man feels how rash it is to enact a law unjust to himself. Quam temere in nosmet legem sensimus iniquam. Nor is it any different if the spectators, but not your opponent, belong to the same sect, guild, industry, club, etc. with you. Let his thesis never be so true. As soon as you insinuate that it is prejudicial to the common interests of the said society, all the spectators will discover that your opponent's arguments, however excellent, are weak and contemptible, and that yours, on the other hand, though random conjectures are correct and objective, you will have a chorus of noisy approval on your side, and your opponent will be driven from the field with ignominy. Nay, the spectators will believe, as a rule, that they agreed with you from pure conviction. For what is not in our interest, for the most part, appears to us absurd, our intellect not being siccum lumen. This trick may be called taking the tree by the roots. Its usual name is argument from usefulness. Disconcern your opponent by mere bombastic. You may also confuse and bewilder your opponent by mere bombast. And the trick is possible because a man generally supposes that there must be some meaning in words. Usually, when people hear words, they believe that there must be some meaning behind them. If he is secretly conscious of his own weakness, and accustomed to hear much that he does not understand and to pretend that he does, you can easily deceive him by some serious deception that seems very profound or learned, depriving him of hearing, sight, and thought, and claiming that this is the most incontrovertible proof of what you assert. It is a well-known fact that some philosophers have recently played this trick on the whole public, with the most brilliant success. But as the present examples are odious, we may refer to the Vicar of Wakefield as an old example. A lawful proof refutes your whole position. If your opponent is right, but fortunately for your argument chooses a faulty proof, you can easily refute it, and then claim that you have refuted his whole position. This is a trick that should be one of the first, is in essence a device that occurs when, instead of attacking someone's argument, you attack the person who presents it. It is presented as an argumentum ad rem. If no proof needs to occur to him or to the spectators, you have won. For example, if someone presents the ontological argument proving the existence of God, you can win because the ontological argument can be easily refuted. This is how bad defenders lose a good argument, by trying to justify it with an authority that is not adequate to them, when no adequate argument can occur to them that focuses on the subject under discussion. Get personal, insultuous, and rude. A final trick is to get personal, insulting, rude as soon as you realize that your opponent has the upper hand and that you will come out worse. It consists of switching from the subject of the dispute, as from a losing game, to the disputant himself and, in some way, attacking him personally. It may be called argumentum ad personam, to distinguish it from the fallacious argument, which passes from the pure and simple objective discussion of the subject to the statements or admissions which your opponent has made on it. But by becoming personal, you leave the subject altogether, and turn your attack upon his person by remarks of an offensive and spiteful character. It is an appeal from the virtues of the intellect to the virtues of the body, or to mere animalism. This is a very popular trick, because everyone is capable of putting it into practice, and therefore it is of frequent application. Now the question is, what counter-artifice is of service to the other party? For if he resorts to the same rule, there will be blows or a duel or an action for slander. We have reached the end of this audiobook. The Virtual Books Publishing team thanks for your visit. If you liked our channel, please subscribe and share. Thank you.